For 3 brutal years, German submarines turned the Atlantic Ocean into a graveyard. Allied merchant ships went down by the hundreds. Entire convoys vanished without a trace. The Nazis called it the happy time, but then something changed. The hunters became the hunted, and what happened next decided the fate of World War II. The U-boat war in the Atlantic wasn't just about torpedoes and depth charges. It was a deadly chess match fought in freezing waters 3 miles deep. On one side, you had German submarine crews who genuinely believed they were unstoppable. On the other side, Allied sailors who watched their friends drown in burning oil night after night after night. This is the story of how technology, courage, and one brilliant invention called Huff-Duff turned the entire war around. And trust me, the truth about what happened down there in those iron coffins is way darker than any movie could show you. September 1939. Britain declares war on Germany. Within hours, a German U-boat torpedoes the passenger liner Athenia. 117 people die, including 28 Americans. The Battle of the Atlantic has begun, and it's going to be the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war. Here's the problem Britain faced, and it was massive. The island nation imported basically everything. Food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, all of it came by ship across the Atlantic from North America. Cut those supply lines and Britain starves. Churchill himself said it later. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril, and the Germans knew it. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man running the U-boat fleet, had a simple strategy. Sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. Drown Britain in the Atlantic. He called it tonnage warfare. Cold, calculated, brutal. At the start of the war, Germany had fewer than 60 U-boats operational. That sounds small, but these weren't your grandfather's submarines. The Type 7 U-boat was the workhorse of the fleet. It could dive to almost 750 feet, travel 8,500 miles without refueling, and carried 14 torpedoes. More importantly, it was small and fast enough to slip past most defenses. The crews? Young guys mostly. Average age was around 21. They volunteered because U-boat service paid better and because propaganda made it sound glamorous. Nobody told them that U-boats had the highest casualty rate of any branch in the German military. 3 out of every 4 U-boat men who went to sea never came back. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about 1940 and early 1941. This period gets called the first happy time by the Germans, and you can probably guess why. It was a turkey shoot. Picture this. You're a U-boat commander cruising off the coast of Ireland. It's nighttime. You're running on the surface because diesel engines are way faster than electric motors, and you need that speed to catch convoys. You spot a line of merchant ships on the horizon, maybe 20 vessels, maybe more. They're sailing in neat rows, nice and slow, making about 8 knots. Most of these merchant ships are unarmed. The few that have guns are usually just old World War I relics that couldn't hit anything anyway. There might be 1 or 2 escort ships with the convoy, but they're stretched thin, trying to protect dozens of merchants with maybe a handful of destroyers or corvettes. So what does the U-boat do? It gets in front of the convoy, waits until dark, then surfaces and cruises right into the middle of the formation. At night, the U-boat's low profile makes it almost invisible. The lookouts on the merchant ships are scanning for periscopes, not surface vessels. And even if someone spots you, what are they going to do? They're cargo ships. They're slow. They can't chase you. The U-boat commander picks his targets. He fires his torpedoes. Boom, boom, boom. Ships explode. Men jump into the freezing Atlantic. Oil catches fire on the water's surface, and guys burn alive or drown trying to swim through it. The U-boat slips away, reloads, and does it again. One guy, Gunther Prien, became famous for this. In October 1939, Just weeks into the war, Preen took his U-boat U-47 right into the British naval base at Scapa Flow in Scotland. Scapa Flow was supposed to be impenetrable. Preen navigated through the defences at night, torpedoed the battleship Royal Oak, killed over 800 British sailors, and escaped. Hitler gave him the Iron Cross. Propaganda made him a national hero, but here's what the propaganda didn't show. Life on a U-boat was absolutely miserable. These boats were tiny. A Type 7 was only about 220 feet long. You had a crew of around 44 to 52 men crammed into that space, sharing it with torpedoes, diesel fuel, machinery, and supplies for months at a time. There was no privacy. You slept in shifts, sometimes sharing bunks hot-racking style, where one guy sleeps while another works. Then they switch. The boat reeked of diesel, sweat, mold, and human waste. The toilet situation was complicated, because if you flushed wrong at the wrong depth, you could flood the boat. Yeah, guys actually died from that. Fresh food ran out within days. After that, you lived on canned goods and bread that grew mold. Humidity inside the boat was always close to 100%. Everything was damp. Your clothes never dried. Skin infections were common. Respiratory problems were common. You couldn't shower for weeks. And the psychological pressure, imagine knowing that any second a depth charge could crack your hull and drown you in seconds, or the boat could sink slowly, and you'd suffocate as oxygen ran out, or fire could break out and burn you alive in that metal tube with no escape. The stress drove men insane, literally. Some guys snapped and had to be restrained. But in 1940 and 1941, the U-boats were winning. Between June 1940 and February 1941, they sank over 500 Allied ships. That's more than 2 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom. Britain was bleeding out. Rationing got tighter. Fuel supplies dropped. The Germans called this the happy time, and they weren't exaggerating from their perspective. Dönitz pushed for more U-boats. He calculated that he needed 300 operational submarines to strangle Britain completely. Hitler kept promising them, but production was slow. Still, with even the limited number they had, the Germans were winning. The Allies weren't stupid. They knew they had to do something or lose the war, so they started adapting. Let's break down the changes because this is where things get interesting. First, convoys got bigger and better organized. Instead of small groups of 10 or 15 ships, you'd have convoys of 40 or 50 vessels traveling together. The logic was simple. It's easier to protect one large group than multiple small groups. More ships in one convoy meant you could allocate more escorts without spreading your forces too thin. The escorts themselves improved. Early in the war, Britain had mostly old destroyers and a new class of small warships called corvettes. Corvettes were tiny, only about 200 feet long, and they rolled like crazy in rough seas. Sailors got seasick constantly, but they were cheap to build and could carry depth charges, so Britain pumped them out by the hundreds. Depth charges are basically barrels packed with explosives. You set them to detonate at a certain depth, roll them off the back of your ship, and hope they explode close enough to a submarine to crack the pressure hull. Early depth charges weren't great. They had to explode within about 20 feet of a submarine to guarantee a kill. Most of the time, they just scared the U-boat away. But the technology improved. The British developed better depth charges that sank faster and exploded with more force. They also invented the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing weapon that shot 24 small bombs in a circular pattern ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, Hedgehogs only exploded on contact, so if you heard an explosion, you knew you'd hit something. Then there was radar. Early radar sets were primitive and couldn't detect small targets like U-boat periscopes. But by 1941, British scientists had developed centimetric radar using a cavity magnetron. This is a piece of technology that honestly doesn't get enough credit. Centimetric radar could detect a U-boat's conning tower on the surface from several miles away, even at night or in bad weather. U-boats had no idea this technology existed at first. They'd gotten used to surfacing at night to recharge batteries and cruise faster. Suddenly, aircraft and escort ships were finding them in the pitch dark. U-boat commanders couldn't figure it out. Some thought the British had invented an infrared detector. Others thought they'd somehow trained seagulls to follow U-boats. I'm not making that up. German intelligence actually considered the seagull theory. Aircraft became a huge problem for U-boats. Early in the war, there was a gap in the middle of the Atlantic where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. This area, called the Black Pit or the Atlantic Gap, was a safe zone for U-boats. They could surface and operate freely without fear of air attack. But then the Allies introduced long-range patrol aircraft like the consolidated B-24 Liberator. These planes could cover the entire Atlantic. They carried radar, depth charges, and later acoustic homing torpedoes. If a U-boat surfaced in daylight, aircraft could spot it and attack before it had time to dive. U-boats needed at least 30 seconds to crash dive. That's how long it took to seal hatches, vent ballast tanks, and submerge. 30 seconds sounds quick, but when an aircraft is diving at you at 200 miles per hour, it's an eternity. Many U-boats got caught on the surface and destroyed before they could dive. Now let's talk about the invention that really changed everything: high-frequency direction finding, or Huff-Duff for short. German U-boats relied heavily on radio communication. Donitz ran a centralized command system. U-boats at sea reported convoy sightings to headquarters. Headquarters analyzed the information and radioed orders back, directing multiple U-boats to converge on the convoy in what they called wolf pack tactics. These wolf pack attacks were devastatingly effective. Instead of one U-boat attacking alone, you'd have 5 or 10 submarines hitting a convoy simultaneously from different directions. Escorts couldn't defend against that. The system worked great, but it had one fatal weakness: all those radio transmissions. The British had been working on direction-finding technology since before the war. The idea was simple in theory. When a radio transmits, it sends out a signal. If you have receivers at different locations, you can triangulate the source of the transmission. Early direction-finding systems were large and slow, taking minutes to get a fix. By that time, the U-boat had stopped transmitting and moved. But British scientists at the Admiralty developed a compact, fast system that could be installed on ships. Huff-Duff could detect a U-boat radio transmission and calculate its direction within seconds. If 2 or more ships in a convoy had Huff-Duff sets, they could cross-reference and pinpoint the U-boat's exact location. Here's why this was a game-changer. U-boats operated by staying hidden. Once you knew where a U-boat was, you could send escorts to hunt it down. Even if you didn't sink it, you forced it to dive and evade, which disrupted its attack. The U-boat couldn't get into position to fire torpedoes if it was busy running away. The Germans didn't realize the Allies had Huff-Duff for a long time. They assumed their Enigma code was unbreakable and their radio transmissions were safe. Even when U-boats started getting attacked right after transmitting, the Germans blamed it on coincidence or superior radar. It wasn't until well into 1943 that Donitz started to suspect something was up. By then it was too late. Huff-Duff had been installed on hundreds of escort ships. Every time a U-boat sent a message, it basically painted a target on itself. Combine Huff-Duff with improved radar, long-range aircraft, better depth charges, more escort ships, and the fact that the Allies were breaking German codes with the ultra-intelligence program, and suddenly the Atlantic became a nightmare for U-boats. By mid-1942, the balance was shifting, but the fight was far from over. In fact, 1942 saw another spike in Allied losses. The Germans called it the Second Happy Time, and it happened off the American coast. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, The US Navy refused to implement convoys along the East Coast. American military leaders thought convoys were defensive and outdated. They wanted to hunt U-boats aggressively. Big mistake. Dunitz sent U-boats to American waters. They found targets everywhere. American cities didn't black out their lights at night, so ships were silhouetted against the glow. U-boats sat offshore and picked off tankers and freighters like shooting fish in a barrel. Between January and August 1942, U-boats sank over 600 ships in American waters. It was a slaughter. Eventually, the Americans implemented convoys, and the killing spree ended, but the damage was done. The Germans sank more tonnage in 1942 than any other year of the war, but 1943 was different. This was the year the tide turned decisively. Several factors combined. First, the Allies were building ships faster than Germany could sink them. American shipyards were pumping out Liberty ships, basic cargo vessels that could be built in less than 2 months. The record was 4 days. Yeah, 4 days from keel laying to launch. They were ugly and slow, but they worked. Second, escort carriers entered service. These were small aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys. Now convoys had their own air cover in the middle of the Atlantic. The Black Pit closed. U-boats couldn't hide anywhere. Third, the Allies had enough escorts to form dedicated hunter-killer groups. Instead of just defending convoys, these groups actively hunted U-boats using Huff-Duff, radar and aircraft. They'd detect a U-boat transmission, vector in, and pursue it relentlessly until they killed it or forced it to run. May 1943 became known as Black May for the Germans. They lost 43 U-boats that month. 43 in 1 month. That's almost a quarter of the operational fleet. The loss rate was unsustainable. Dunitz pulled the remaining U-boats back from the North Atlantic. It was an admission of defeat. The Allies had won the Battle of the Atlantic. But the U-boat crews still at sea didn't know that. They kept fighting. Let's get into what combat was actually like, because this is where the human element really comes through. Imagine you're on a U-boat, cruising submerged during the day to avoid aircraft. It's hot, the air is stale. You're tired because you haven't slept properly in days. Suddenly, the hydrophone operator picks up propeller sounds, lots of them, a convoy. The captain orders the boat to periscope depth. He takes a look. 20 merchant ships, 5 escorts. The convoy is zigzagging, changing course every few minutes to make torpedo attacks harder. The escorts are pinging with sonar, active sonar that sends out sound waves and listens for echoes. If they get a return, they know something's down there. You calculate firing solutions, range, speed, angle. Torpedoes are dumb weapons. You fire them on a preset course and they run straight until they hit something or run out of fuel. Hitting a moving target from a moving platform underwater is incredibly difficult. It's like throwing a dart while riding a roller coaster and trying to hit a balloon floating in the wind. You fire. The torpedo leaves the tube with a loud clunk. Everyone holds their breath. You count the seconds. 60 seconds, 90, 2 minutes, then boom. You hear the explosion through the hull. Hit, but now the escorts know where you are. They're turning toward you. The captain orders, "Dive, dive, emergency dive." The boat tilts nose down. You're dropping fast, trying to get below the thermocline layer where sonar doesn't work as well. The depth gauge spins. 100 meters, 150, 200. Above you, the escorts are dropping depth charges. You hear the splashes as they hit the water. Then wham, wham, wham. The explosions are deafening even through the water and the steel hull. The boat shakes like it's being hit with a giant hammer. Light bulbs shatter. Dust and cork insulation rain down from the ceiling. A depth charge explodes close. The boat lurches. You hear a metallic groan. Somewhere a pipe cracks and water starts spraying. Men rush to seal it. If you can't stop the leak, you'll flood. If you surface to escape, The escorts will blow you out of the water with gunfire. You go deeper, 250 meters. The hull creaks and pops under the pressure. These boats are rated for 200 meters max, but you go deeper because you have no choice. Every man is silent. You can hear the escort's propellers churning overhead, the ping of their sonar hitting your hull. More depth charges. The boat shudders. Equipment breaks. The lights go out. You're in total darkness except for emergency lighting. The air is getting bad. Carbon dioxide builds up. Men start gasping. Some pass out. Hours pass. The escorts won't leave. They know you're down here. They're patient. They'll wait you out. Your batteries are dying. You need to surface eventually, but if you surface now, you die. Finally, after 6 hours, the sounds fade. The escorts have moved on, maybe chasing another contact. You creep to the surface, blow ballast to tanks, and break through. The crew staggers up to the conning tower, gulping fresh air. You've survived, but barely. And you've got to do this again tomorrow. This was daily life. In the U-boat war, let's talk numbers because they're staggering. Germany built over 1,100 U-boats during the war. Around 785 were lost in combat or accidents. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats, about 28,000 died. That's a 70% casualty rate. Compare that to the overall German military casualty rate of around 30%. U-boat service was a death sentence. On the Allied side, over 3,500 merchant ships were sunk. Around 30,000 merchant sailors died. These weren't military personnel. They were civilians mostly, guys who signed up to haul cargo and ended up getting torpedoed in the middle of the night, and the escorts lost men too. Destroyers, corvettes, frigates. When a U-boat torpedoed an escort, it usually sank fast. Warships don't have much buoyancy. They go down in minutes, and if you're below deck when it hits, you probably don't get out. There's one story that really captures the horror of this. In September 1940, a convoy called SC-7 was crossing the Atlantic. It had 35 merchant ships and only 2 escorts. A wolf pack of 7 U-boats found it. Over 2 nights, they sank 20 of the 35 ships. 20, one convoy. The escorts were helpless. They'd charge at one U-boat, and while they were chasing it, another U-boat would torpedo 3 ships from a different direction. The merchant sailors watched their friends die, knowing they could be next, and there was nothing they could do. You can't run. You can't fight back. You just hope the torpedo misses. One merchant sailor, Raymond Thompson, survived 3 different ships being torpedoed. 3 times he ended up in the freezing Atlantic. The 3rd time, he was in the water for 14 hours before a rescue ship found him. Most guys didn't last that long. Hypothermia killed you in minutes if the burning oil didn't get you first. Thompson said later that the worst part wasn't the explosions or even the water. It was the waiting. You'd be on a ship and you'd hear rumors that U-boats were in the area. Then you'd just wait, night after night, knowing that any moment could be your last. The psychological stress broke men. On the U-boat side, the stress was just as bad, maybe worse. U-boat commanders had to maintain morale, knowing that most of them wouldn't survive the war. They'd lose friends, entire crews, and just keep going out again. There's a famous photo of U-boat crews returning to base in France. They're wearing leather coats, looking tough and confident. But if you look at their eyes, you can see the exhaustion. These guys were running on fumes. Some U-boat men kept diaries. One wrote, "We live like rats in a sewer, and we'll probably die like rats too." Another wrote about hearing a merchant ship's crew screaming in the water after he torpedoed them. He couldn't sleep for days. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. Post-traumatic stress wasn't really recognized back then, but plenty of guys came back from the Atlantic with what we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, anxiety, survivor's guilt. So what was the turning point? When did the Allies definitively win? Most historians point to May 1943. That month, the combination of Huff-Duff, centimetric radar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and sheer numbers of escorts made it impossible for U-boats to operate effectively. But there's one battle that really shows how the dynamics shifted. The battle for Convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May 1943. ONS-5 was a slow convoy heading from Britain to North America. It had 42 merchant ships and 7 escorts. A wolf pack of over 30 U-boats was vectored in to attack it. 30 U-boats. This should have been a massacre. The battle lasted 5 days. The weather was terrible, heavy fog and rough seas, which actually helped the convoy because the U-boats couldn't see well to attack. But when the weather cleared, the U-boats moved in. They sank 13 merchant ships. That sounds bad, but here's the thing. The escorts sank 6 U-boats and damaged several others so badly they had to retreat. Normally, losing 13 merchants would be considered a disaster. But forcing a wolf pack to break off after losing 6 U-boats, that was a victory. It was the first time a convoy had inflicted heavier losses on the attackers than it suffered. The Germans realized they were losing the exchange rate. Sinking a few merchants wasn't worth losing multiple U-boats and their trained crews. Dönitz made the decision to withdraw from the North Atlantic right after this battle. He later wrote in his memoir that he knew the Battle of the Atlantic was lost at that moment. But the U-boat war didn't end in May 1943. Not even close. Dönitz refused to give up. He kept sending U-boats out, partly because he believed that they still tied up Allied resources, and partly because he was a loyal Nazi who wouldn't admit defeat. The Germans tried to innovate. They developed the snorkel, a device that let U-boats run diesel engines while submerged just below the surface. This meant they didn't have to surface as often, making them harder to spot. Snorkels helped, but they weren't a game changer. They also worked on advanced submarine designs. The Type WWII U-boat was revolutionary. It could travel at 17 knots submerged, faster than most escort ships on the surface. It had a streamlined hull, better batteries, and could stay underwater for days. If the Type WWII had entered service earlier, it might have changed the war. But it didn't. Production delays, Allied bombing of German factories, and the general chaos of the collapsing Third Reich meant the Type WWII never saw real combat. A few were completed near the end of the war, but they didn't get a chance to prove themselves. Meanwhile, Allied anti-submarine technology kept improving. Acoustic homing torpedoes, better sonar, more aircraft. By 1944, sending a U-boat on patrol was basically a suicide mission. The odds of coming back were slim, yet the U-boats kept going out. Why? Orders, discipline, desperation. Maybe some crews still believed in the cause, others just did their duty. The last U-boat sinking of the war happened on May 7, 1945, one day before Germany surrendered. U-2336 torpedoed 2 British ships off Scotland. Then it dove and disappeared. Germany surrendered the next day and the U-boat war ended. In total, over 2,800 Allied ships were sunk by U-boats. Germany lost 785 U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous battle of World War II, and it came closer to deciding the outcome than most people realize. So, what can we take away from all this? First, technology matters, but it's not everything. The Germans had excellent U-boats and skilled crews, but they lost because the Allies outproduced them, out-innovated them, and adapted faster. Huff-Duff, radar, long-range aircraft, all of these were crucial, but so was the sheer determination of the merchant sailors who kept crossing the Atlantic, even though they knew they might not make it. Second, logistics win wars. Britain stayed in the fight because the convoys got through. If the U-boats had succeeded in cutting the Atlantic supply line, Britain would have been forced to negotiate. D-Day never would have happened. The war in Europe would have gone very differently. Third, the human cost was enormous on both sides. This wasn't some abstract strategic battle. Real people died, thousands of them. Young guys in their 20s, drowned, blown apart, burned alive. Merchant sailors who just wanted to do their job. U-boat crews who were told they were heroes but ended up as statistics. The U-boat war was brutal, unforgiving, and terrifying. There was no glory in it, just survival. The men who fought it on both sides deserve to be remembered not as heroes or villains, but as human beings caught in a nightmare. And the technology that turned the tide, Huff-Duff in particular, showed that sometimes the smallest innovations have the biggest impact. A direction-finding radio receiver doesn't sound exciting compared to aircraft carriers or tanks, but it helped win the war. The Atlantic was a graveyard for thousands of men. The U-boat crews thought they ruled those waters, thought they were invincible, but technology caught up with them. The hunters became the hunted, and in the end, the ocean swallowed them all. If this story hit you, subscribe if you want more history that challenges what you think you know.